This episode of the Curious About Cannabis podcast is brought to you by you, our dedicated listeners and supporters. Thanks to your continued listening, sharing, and donations, we've been able to continue the show free from third-party advertisers and sponsors. So, thank you. And if you'd like to learn about other ways you can support the show, visit patreon.com/curiousaboutcannabis.
Marcus Bubbleman Richardson, hash maker, cannabis aficionado, cannabis warrior.
You're listening to the Curious About Cannabis podcast. Hey everybody, this is Jason Wilson with the Curious About Cannabis podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in once again. So today I'm really stoked to connect to a new acquaintance of mine, someone that you've possibly heard about, especially if you've been around in the cannabis industry a while, like myself and some other colleagues we've had on here. But I'm here with Marcus Richardson. You may also know him as Bubbleman or BC Bubbleman. But thanks so much, Marcus, for being willing to come on the podcast today.
Yeah, absolutely. I heard your interview you did with Dr. Mark Chaldone, and I know that he hooked us both up. So I'm always happy to do interviews with people that have a good focus and a good grasp on what they're doing. I thought that was a good interview you and Mark did. So I was happy to take part.
Yeah, totally. And for anyone that is unaware, one thing that was really cool about our sort of connection between Mark Chaldone and everything is you used to have, I don't know if you'd even call it a podcast back then or not, but you used to have a show called Hash Church that Dr. Chaldone would come on, it seems like fairly regularly, with some frequency, to talk about all things cannabis and cannabis extraction and stuff. So if anyone is familiar with Hash Church, you might have seen Dr. Chaldone on there, and Marcus is the brains behind Hash Church. And I saw you did Hash Church 2.0 not too long ago, kind of revived it. I was familiar with it back in like 2014, I think, or something like that, kind of a ways back.
The early days, yes. We're even in a 3.0 now. We did an episode last Sunday, just a few days ago. We did a Hash Church episode. So they're certainly not as often as they were. I was doing them every single Sunday. In fact, I didn't miss a Sunday, I believe, for 167 episodes.
Wow.
So that was, 167 weeks. It was over 3 years without missing an episode. It was quite a challenge, and it did cause me a little bit of stress, but it's because I realized I had something special there, and I wanted to make sure that I didn't pollute it or dilute it or affect it in a negative way. So trying not to monetize it, trying to keep it authentic, trying to keep it transparent. And that was easier said than done, but we've managed to pull it off for the last, I don't know, must be going on year 5 now, maybe even 6 of Hash Church.
Yeah, definitely, and it's definitely a process trying to figure out how to maintain programming like that without monetizing. It's something I'm going through right now, of trying to keep Curious About Cannabis going and everything, but not bringing in sponsors or advertisers that might affect what you say or make you think twice about what you might say, or manipulate the authenticity or anything. And it's hard. So yeah, my hat's off to you for being able to do that for so long. It's very impressive. And anyone that's listening, if you're not familiar with Hash Church, I mean, we have a million things to talk about, but that's one you can dive into hours upon hours, years upon years of content there. So check that out. Marcus, do you mind for folks listening that are kind of newer to the industry, maybe aren't familiar with some of your background and all the different things that you've been involved in? I'm not sure how far back to go, because you have interesting history with like hemp cultivation and getting your licensing for all of that. But I guess as far back as you want to start, how did you come to build this passion towards the cannabis plant? Where does that come from, and kind of what got you interested in pursuing all the things that you've done over the years?
Well, I'm definitely a very particular kind of individual. And at a very young age, I think I was about 14, I smoked my first joint with a friend of mine, Steve McAvoy, behind the dumpster of the local, Quickie Mart type
Right.
store. And it was instant. It was just like right out of that movie, Half Baked. Abba Zaba, you my only friend. Like when they're all baked and they're
Yeah.
walking into the store. And it was
Right. The
just
icing
instant
machine.
for me. Yeah, it was instant for me. So it really started right then and there. I made the choice, not to consume alcohol or tobacco or caffeine or pharmaceutical drugs or really any of the illicit drugs
Hmm.
aside from psychedelics and cannabis. Sort of stayed pure in that way and just focused my energies on those things. And I think it's one thing to focus your energy on those things. It's another to make sure that you avoid the other things that tend to dilute the focus on those things in the first place. So being able to, remove those things from my options
Yeah.
really sort of gave me this super like concentrated version of getting into this plant, and I was really able to focus on it. It wasn't too much longer. I was probably 18, 19 when I started looking into the hemp activism,
Hmm.
being from Manitoba, Bible Belt, center of Canada, very, particular place to be, very easy to get in trouble if you want to
Hmm.
start playing around with cannabis. And the trouble there was real. It was jail time. You would go to prison if you got caught with it. There weren't too many people getting slapped on the wrists and being let go. So that sort of directed me, towards this hemp movement. And there really wasn't a hemp movement at the time, but I got into hanging out with a couple of key people. One was Martin Moravchuk, who ended up being one of my partners and founders of the Manitoba Hemp Exchange, Hemp Seeds Unlimited, and eventually Manitoba Harvest, the company that he built and created with his partners, all of people who I introduced him to. So I was very close into that niche. We were applied for a license in 94 to get hemp growing legally in Manitoba for the first time in 73 years. And we got the license. So we were able to grow an experimental 5-acre field. Experimental was the stipulation of that regulation. And from 94, 95, 96, 97, and 98, it was all experimental. In 1998, the province changed the law. And they made it, the country changed the law, Ottawa changed the law from experimental to commercial, which meant now you could actually create a business and start making money. And so that was really the first thing, having that hemp store, bringing the farmers over from the Ukraine, finding low THC hemp seed that was
Hmm.
below 0.3% THC. In fact, we had found the Zolotonosha out of the Ukraine, which was actually 0.03%. Goroborodko from the Institute of Bass Fibers had been approached by the DEA, decades prior, and told he could get rid of THC or he could get rid of hemp. Now, hemp had been grown in the Ukraine for 100 plus years,
Right.
so it wasn't really an option for them to get rid of that. But he figured out a very simple method using litmus paper. He could go out into the fields and he could litmus test some buds, and basically ones that looked a particular way, one that attracted his attention, that looked different from the low THC cultivars. He would litmus test, and if it turned purple, it was very likely that the number percentage of THC was going to be higher than what he wanted, and he would just pull those plants. And he
Hmm.
did that for like over a decade, maybe close to 2 decades.
Wow.
And what happened was he created Zolotonosha, the 3, 7, 9, 11, 13, 15, 17, all these different Zolotonoshas. And they are the lowest THC plants, or at least they were for
Hmm.
the longest time. There are CBG cultivars now that are very high in CBG, 12 to 15%. And if you understand the synthesization of cannabinoids and how it happens in the gland head, CBGA is, of course, the first cannabinoid to be produced. And if all the other gene synthases are turned off, then you won't get any other cannabinoids. It'll literally just stay CBG. So before that happened, Zolotonosha was the youngest, lowest, smallest THC percentage on the planet, and that's what we brought to Canada to approach our government with and say, hey, listen, the law is 0.3. We've got 0.03. we showed them the Popular Mechanics article from 1932, which was on the front page, the $1 billion crop, first
Yep.
time billion and dollar had ever been used in an economic statement. And we approached our government with a page, a deck page, the front page that said the $1 trillion crop. And so at first he was thinking like, oh my God, you guys don't waste my time. But we managed, just open the first page and check and see the Popular Mechanics article. And it piqued his interest. The low THC piqued his interest. And it was a very short period after that we ended up getting a license and were able to start growing hemp. So very shortly after that, 96, a couple of years later, I would move out to British Columbia. My one main friend and contact out here was Hillary Black. Hillary Black, of course, is the founder of the BC Compassion Club. So she was really very inspired by Valerie Corral, Mike Corral down in California with Wham. She was inspired by Todd McCormick. She had all these different inspirations in California that were kind of pushing her on one side to maybe move down to California and be a part of things there, or stay in British Columbia and start her own sort of dispensary club. And that's kind of when I moved into BC, and she was, hey, what should I do? Where should I go back down here? Should I stay up here? And I was like, well, listen, I just moved here and I'd very much like you to stay here. And anything I can facilitate and help with, I would absolutely do. So for years, I helped facilitate cannabis flow into the BC Compassion Club through donations, through finding contacts for them, and just really doing anything that I could for the Compassion Club, because I believed in it so much, and it was one of those things that you would be willing to lose money on every single experience that you came in contact with the club. If I came in contact with the club, I just wanted to know at the end of it that they made something and I lost something, because I just couldn't bring myself to lower my integrity to the point where I would profit off of terminally ill people. And nor could Hillary. And so she really gave up the life of a fairly well-to-do first world West Vancouver girl to move to East Vancouver to start helping people who live on the streets, mental health issues, terminal diseases, and for her to give herself to the service of that was very noble and inspirational. So I kind of followed in behind her to learn as much as I could in that lessons of humility, and to be as good of a person as possible. And Hillary is certainly a good person to learn those lessons from. That lasted till about 1998. Towards the end of 98, the start of 1999, I started a company called Fresh Headies. And Fresh Headies would sell now world famous bubble bags. Back then, nobody knew about them. I coined the term bubble bags. I coined the term bubble hash. And I gave myself the silly moniker of Bubbleman that will follow me to my grave, I'm sure, at this point. And we started, making these my wife was sewing them in our kitchen living room.
Oh, wow.
And I was selling them online on sites like Overgrow and cannabis.com and cannabisculture.com and cannabisworld.com, and really sort of promoting this, homemade hash experience. Funny enough, butane method came out like 2 months after the bubble bags came out, which was March 1999.
Oh, wow.
I think, like maybe a month or two later, Indra released the BHO method, and it was kind of like, here we go, like these two pathways began. Now, people knew about butane prior, people knew about water extraction prior, but there's no doubt that Indra popularized BHO and that I popularized bubble hash. There's just no doubt about those two things whatsoever. So yeah, led that to starting to do all this educational stuff, and it got me into photography because I wanted to share the photos. And suddenly now I'm learning to be a professional photographer, so I can share these photos in the way that they look. I've always had an extremely sensitive olfactory, which was really led me to almost becoming a cannabis sommelier before it even existed. I could understand and smell the complexities of the terpene profiles. I could understand and seek out the highest caliber, highest quality cannabis, and I was always known for that, even at a young age. Oh yeah, go see Mark. He's got the best stuff, because it was important to me to find that stuff, to find growers who felt that it was an obligation to grow great cannabis, not a right. So that was also another kind of part of it. And over the course of 20 plus years of doing that and taking photography and raising the bar on the skill level, and just continually going deeper down the rabbit hole and educating people on simple things like capitate stalk trichomes, capitate
Mhm.
sessile trichomes, bulbous trichomes, all the terminology, anthocyanin, the purple striations
Yeah.
that are an antioxidant, a lot of these things. I was one of the very first people to actually start breaking that out into the mainstream, at least into the cannabis groups and into these other groups, and really promoting and educating. And I was learning it myself
Mhm.
through scientist friends that would explain to me what the photos were that I were taking. So, because at first I didn't know a lot of this terminology, but that's
Yeah.
how I learned it by taking the photos. And so, 20 years later, I'm now a voice of authority for the subject. I do consulting all over the world. I have my company in Jamaica, Cannabinoid Research and Development. I have my Fresh Headies company, and then most recently, well, I do a little bit of consulting for a tissue culture company called Segra International, which we can get into and talk a
Yeah.
little bit about that. And then, of course, I'm a partner and a big part of things over at Whistler Technologies, where we do commercial industrial scale water extraction equipment and make it available to those that want to play on a little bit of a bigger level. And then finally, and most importantly, I'm a founder at my company Embark Health, and so Embark Health is a large scale extraction facility that I'm in right now in Delta, British Columbia. We have another facility that we're building in Woodstock, Ontario, and we're going to be doing 7 different modalities of extraction. Solventless is what I'm focused on, but I
Yeah.
have brought in Mike West, the chemist who did Cresco's Labs and Green Lion and a
Oh,
bunch of
cool.
different
Yeah.
things down in the US. He's up here working with us as well, so we're really excited about moving things forward with Embark.
Nice. Yeah. So much. It's fascinating to meet someone who has had such a well-rounded experience with the cannabis plant that you've kind of come in the spiral around the plant from the hemp side and all of that, and what all of that teaches you as far as genetics and chemistry, the biosynthesis of cannabinoids and all of that, and then into extraction, and then even into the macro photography. Um, it's yeah, it's super fascinating just to think about your experiences. And one thing that I wanted to make sure that we touch on multiple angles is the changes that you've seen over, let's say, the past 25 years or so, and particularly in Canada, um, because Canada recently has sort of been trying to legalize. I mean, um, they have legalized. It's a model that not everyone is super stoked about, I guess. I've talked to different people. Some people are happy with it. Some people are kind of frustrated. Um, so I guess to find a starting point, let's focus on the hemp stuff, and then we'll spiral out into everything else. So how old were you when in '95 when you received that license?
I was 21 years old.
So how did that feel to like get that license in hand and know that you were stepping into this world of like being able to work with the cannabis plant legitimately, legally, professionally, and and to see that sort of door open.
Well, it felt amazing. And I mean, it felt amazing for the most part, not because of the government and the police and all the people who said you can't do it, but because of all of our supporters and all the people who should have been our supporters and all the closest people in our lives and our friends
Yeah,
who told us it was impossible, who told us that it would never happen, who said that it would happen when pigs flew and things like this, or when hell freezes over, which I would remind
right.
them, we are living in Winnipeg, and Winnipeg is colder than Mars in the winter. So freezing hell over in Winnipeg is not really a big challenge.
I've
So
been there,
yeah,
done that.
that's yeah, exactly. So that was kind of, obviously it was a pretty great feeling, and being able to visit the hemp fields.
Hmm.
My mentor Ron Hickey, who taught me how to grow at a very young age and really took me under his wing and taught me how to be obsessive compulsive about cannabis and really focus on the plant and listen to the plant and learn from the plant. Um, I was able to take him to the first hemp field that we grew, and this is a man who served 11 years in
Yeah.
prison for growing cannabis. 11 years in prison for growing
Hmm.
cannabis. I'll repeat that. He served much more time than most murderers and rapists do
Yep.
in our country. Even if you were to sort of kidnap children and do heinous things to children, you still probably wouldn't get 11 years in prison in Canada. So, here's a man that was the most compassionate, empathetic, inspiring human being that you could possibly imagine, serving time with child killers and rapists and murderers and all of these different people. And of course, what did he do while he was there? He made it a better place. He made it an easier place. He cut down on the fighting. He stood in as a sort of moderator to make sure that, when groups were upset with other groups, he could kind of step in there and roll a little pinner and smoke a little joint and say, hey, you don't want to go stab that guy, like, let's just work this out. So of course, even in prison, the guy is doing the good work, but he never belonged there. And when we took him to the field and I saw tears well up in his eyes, that was when I really understood the profound nature of what we were doing here and how much it was going to affect the way people thought, regardless if they ever ate the product, wore the
Right.
product, smoked the product. Just seeing it on the side of the road was going to change the way they thought about it. So that was pretty inspirational.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's such a huge step towards changing the stigma around the cannabis plant. Just having it in front of people. I mean, it's something that we've been experiencing in Oregon, especially since I don't know, the late years of the medical program going into the transition into legalization, where you start to see sizable farms, fairly frequently, and then when hemp was legalized in the United States. So I mean, now you see huge hemp fields everywhere, and it changes the whole atmosphere around the plant, and it kind of brings that tension down a little bit when people are seeing it all the time, whether they have any relationship with the plant or not. Is still working on that stigma and kind of softening those responses so that people don't necessarily have such an intense knee-jerk reaction about it if they might otherwise have. And when you got the license and you were growing hemp those first several years that it was all research and development, what was that research and development focused on?
Well, a variety of things. I mean, first of all, yes, you're right. Growing hemp changes the narrative. It crushes the propaganda narrative and slowly but surely disassembles it and recreates a new narrative that people have
Yeah.
to make up, because now everything that was based on lies is now like, well, that plant doesn't look super dangerous. Like, there's like 50 acres of it right there. Like,
Yep.
what the heck's going on here? So, I mean, a lot of things back then was, okay, we can grow hemp. Now we had stars in our eyes. We were like, oh, there's 50,000 commercial products that you can do with hemp. Little did we realize there's $50 billion of infrastructure that's required for 50,000 commercial products of hemp. So, we thought that we were going to have like, fiber and cellulose and
Hmm.
seeds
Yeah.
and like all of these different sort of things. Well, in Canada, what really happened was, you're growing these things, you're testing the soil. One of the things that came out of it right off the bat, which was very interesting, the first hemp field grown in Canada was grown by Joe Strobel and Jeff Kime, a tobacco farmer and a lawyer. They got their license just 1 year before us. We actually got our license. We applied in 94. We got it in 95. They applied for their license at the start of 94. They ended up getting their license for 94, and they grew the first
Mm.
only 5 acre hemp field. They grew it on a radioactive tobacco field. Of course, if you understand
Wow.
tobacco
Yeah.
growing, they,
Hmm.
they spray radium 226 on tobacco. It's a radioactive nucleotide that raises the levels of nicotine naturally or unnaturally. Because of it, they have to test their soil. So after he grew his first experimental hemp field and he tested his soil, they were completely surprised and confused as to why the radioactive levels were so low.
Mm.
It was disconcerting to them. They eventually found it inside the hemp plant. This taught us that hemp is phytoremediative for radioactive nucleotides, and a company that we were involved with at the time called Consolidated Growers and Processors started a program in Chernobyl to grow hemp and remove radioactive nucleotides out of the soil. Now, obviously, all you're doing is moving that
Right.
radiation, and it's going to end up in the plant. And we were looking at a couple of different technologies. There was a Russian scientist who was using electron cluster technology to basically, just take radiation apart piece by piece, neutralizing it. The other option was a little more archaic. It was burning the material
Mm,
and glassifying the ash. Not
yeah.
super ideal to be having landmines of radioactive material and waste all around the planet. But that was a project that happened really within the first year of hemp growing in Canada because of that accidental discovery.
Yeah.
So pretty interesting, from that standpoint. People have learned now since that. It's very common knowledge that hemp is a phytoremediative plant, but
Mhm.
prior to that, nobody knew that hemp was a phytoremediative plant, at least in the circles that I was flowing in. You weren't reading about it in books, you weren't talking to people about it. It was really a unique Canadian innovation that brought forth that. Eventually, what happened though with all the R&D, you know, we understood that if we were going to try and grow fiber, there was a massive amounts of money that would be needed for infrastructure. That hemp was unique. It was a very strong fiber that you wouldn't just be able to run it through a cotton ginny and run it through
Yeah.
all the machines that cotton uses. It's just not like that. And in fact, it messes up machines left, right, and center because the fiber is so strong. Same thing with the cellulose. The cellulose we thought was miraculous because of the lignin concentration being so low, lignin being quite high in trees, upwards of 70 plus percentage, which is why you require chlorine to reduce the lignin down and to separate from your herds to be able to make paper and pulp products like that. With hemp, the lignin concentration was so low, the percentage of fiber was in the 70 percentages, fiber and cellulose.
Wow.
So you didn't
Yeah.
you didn't really have to go into that chlorine delignifier. And so, that was another thing that was learned. And really, we were kind of pushed into this grain. You're in Canada, you're in the prairies, everyone's growing grain for Cargill. There's all
Mhm.
different types of grain that are be growing, and that's really where hemp took off in the essential amino acid complexities that the seed oil produces, that embryo. And so you, in a very short period of time after 1998, a gentleman by the name of Paul Bobby, who's one of Canada's largest seed dehullers and seed crushers, I think he processed over 25 million pounds of seed last year, to give you an idea of the
Wow.
size of his operation. And he
Yeah.
started in 1998, the minute commercial viability came down. So he was one of the guys that was pressing the oil, creating protein powder isolates, creating oil, creating dehulled seeds. He created this dehuller and he set it up in a really unique way that allowed him to do some pretty big numbers, which a lot of people hadn't figured out. And so it really kind of, the whole business fell into this sort of the health aspect of hemp.
Mhm.
The all of the essential amino acids that your body needs but can't produce are produced in
Yep.
hemp seed oil. That's 9 that adults require, plus the 3 that children require for bone and organ development. And we really sort of fell into this niche of like, okay, we can make money with seed. And that's really where the Canadian hemp marketplace stood for the last 20 plus years. There hasn't been a lot of companies making money off of fiber or making
Mhm.
money off of paper products or pulp products or anything like that. Everything has pretty much been exclusively the hemp seed oil, and the hemp seed protein powder isolate.
Yeah. And is the reason that um, it's been so challenging for farmers to get into the fiber markets and that sort of thing, is it just the infrastructure costs alone, or is there also a market element as well, that's kind of
I,
driving
th-
that?
I think they're both being driven by that for sure. But at the same time, you have to understand that when you figure out a way to make money with a crop, and now people are able to make money, they can grow grain and get paid a certain amount per acre, and it's still
Right.
pretty nice, pretty tasty prices compared to growing other grains. You understand that, unfortunately for hemp, it's not like you can plant one plant and get the best buds, get the highest quality seed, get the nicest fiber, get the most percentage of cellulose. These are all very specific things. With hemp, you can get the one from the whole in the highest number. You might get a little extra on the side, but hemp doesn't really seem to work like that. It's not
Yeah.
like you plant a plant and you're like, oh, we're going to use the fiber for this, or they're going to use the cell.
Right.
It's like the fiber's crap when you grow for bud or for seed.
Hmm.
And when it's how you plant it, and it's the cultivars that you plant, and it's the gene synthases that are present in the plant to allow it to express itself, and all of these different things, including the terroir and the
Yep.
appalachia that the plant is growing under, is going to decide how it grows. And unfortunately, A perfect example is the Canadian CBD market. All of these Canadian farmers think that they're going to continue to grow grain, not understanding that when you fertilize a female plant, when it gets when a male and a female get together in the hemp field, basically the plant really stops producing cannabinoids and it starts putting its energy into the embryo production of that plant now. So seed production takes an enormous amount of energy from a plant. So these guys end up getting a nice grain harvest, and then they're like, well, we've got this chafe and it's 1.5% CBD. But we have like 65,000 hectares of it. And it's like, well, okay, the problem is from an extraction standpoint that there is no economic viability to be had at 1.5% cannabinoids. In fact, anything really under 8% is hard to pay for because, Buddy's running 1.5 and then you bring in a 15%. Well, now you're getting literally like 7 to 15 times the yield that you would have from the other stuff, and it's like that's pretty important from an economic standpoint, from an extractor standpoint, that we don't want to waste all our time processing something that's got such low yields. Now, if there's nothing else available, I would get it, but and I've had conversations with Canadian farmers. They want to get their seed and their grain crop in, and they want to also make money on CBD. And they're just disconnected from the reality that if you want to grow CBD, you do it the way they are in America, which is you plant all female plants and you grow big plants and you get 10 to 18% CBD cultivars. That's how you grow CBD. You don't do it with a 1.5% chafe that you're taking off of your seed. And then there's obviously if there's seed involved, depending on your process of extraction, you're going to be extracting all those different plant fats and out of the
Yep.
seed. The essential amino
Yep.
acids are going to be mixed in with your oil. And that's not really ideal either, particularly for inhalation and other methods of consumption.
Right, and you run into shelf stability issues and stuff too. Some of those fatty acids and oils can go rancid faster than
Of
others, and
course.
yeah, and so it's a tricky thing, and we've seen similar things here in the United States too. That once hemp was legalized in 2018, everyone wanted to figure out how to do everything with the cannabis plant. How do I get my resin crop for CBD, because that's what everyone here is focused on, and now CBG. But then also, how do I turn my stalks into this or that or the other? And that's through talking to people with a lot of experience with hemp. That's something I've learned that I hadn't had a lot of direct experience in, is that these stalks are very different when they're grown for when the plants are grown for resin production, and it's just not as simple as trying to clip all the buds off, yank the stalks out, and send those to a processor, and then get paid for all of these different things.
That
Yeah,
was the
it's
utopian version that everyone thought was gonna. We thought the same thing. We're like, this is gonna be amazing.
right.
We'll just
Yeah, why
plant, we'll
not?
just plant tons and have this truck come in and pick up the stalks, and have this truck come in and pick up the buds and filter out the seeds and do this and that. But it's the one from the whole when it comes to
Mhm.
cannabis. I feel the same way about the resin. If you want to use cannabis as a medicine, if you want to shrink tumors and reduce
Mhm.
tremors, and you want to increase appetite and stimulate sleep, and all of these different things, this comes from the medicine that is created and produced inside the glandular trichome. It's not produced anywhere else on the plant, and this took a
Yep.
long time to explain to people. Oh, but it's in the roots, and it goes into the leaf, and it's like, no, no, it really doesn't. It's all right there in the glandular trichome heads. Those are the labs: the bulbous, the sessile, and the capitate stalks. And once you learn that, you can start looking at the plant a lot differently. We don't need the plant from a regenerative, sustainable, organic farming perspective. What a beautiful thing to be able to grow medicine, grow it by the
Yep.
field, take that medicine, isolate and extract the glandular trichomes, and then take that material and put it all back into the field. The very things
Yeah.
that you've taken out of the soil,
Hmm.
you can now feed back into, because 90%, 80% of that plant is actually just biomass that is
Yeah.
cellulose and fiber.
Yeah. And this is actually transitioning into sort of the next phase here. So when you started to wrap your mind around high resin cannabis production and understanding the medicinal value, and you're starting to understand cannabinoids and terpenes, is that where the motivation came from to start to find better ways of sifting these trichome heads out of the material? Is that what sort of started to lead towards making the bubble bags and running down that road?
I mean, yes and no. What really led to that was 1995. I went to Amsterdam for the Cannabis Cup.
Hmm.
It was my first Cannabis Cup. I had a booth there with my hemp partners, and we were selling hemp materials. And we had Jack Herer right next to us on one side and Eagle Bill
Nice.
vaporizing on the other side. It was
Wow.
great. It
Yeah.
was amazing. Jack was a huge inspiration. And in fact, he was the main reason we got into hemp because of his book. It gave
Yep.
us everything we needed to go to our minister of finance and agriculture and approach them for a license to grow hemp. Um, what really inspired it was being in Amsterdam, and this is a ridiculously hilarious, silly story. But I was behind the greenhouse on the dam rack, and there's a Thai food restaurant that used to be there. It was run. It was all Katoys who were waitresses, so it was all lady boys. It was all like
Hmm.
before they had transgenders, they just called them
Right.
Katoys in Thailand, lady boys. And so we were at this restaurant, and it's very small and really spectacular food. And I bumped into Rob Clark. And Rob
Wow.
Clark
Yeah.
had Rob Clark had a bong, and he was a Ruhr bong, and he was standing on the stairs of this restaurant. And I was like, "Oh, what's going down?" And he said, "Well, you know what they say, if it don't bubble, it ain't worth the trouble." And then he lit this bong, and I watched the hash inside of it that was powder just turn to an oil and like drip through the screen and like drip down the bong. And I was just like, I had no idea that was the infamous Skunkman Sam Sift, and Rob and Dave were like best friends. And Skunkman Sam doesn't he wasn't going out at the time, so it was like you could bump into Rob, but you certainly weren't going to bump into Sam.
Yeah.
I ended up becoming good friends with Rob and Sam, for that matter, over the years. Both became good friends, and Rob actually ended up coming to my house later that year. Hillary Black from the Compassion Club brought him by, so I ended up having him by my house and getting to kind of get into deeper conversations. But seeing that hash melt into a liquid that was made solventlessly, like dry sift, I just
Right.
couldn't wrap my head around it, and I never stopped. I started getting into sifting, and I was like, I can't make anything like that. That's when I started learning about carding, and I started teaching people
Mm-hmm.
that you could card the material. And around 97, 98, I started hearing a little bit here and there about water hash. I finally saw the isolator bags, probably really less than 6 months before I came out with my own bags. I saw some isolator bags. It was a two-bag system, which when I look back now, that is so archaic. I'm very lucky that I was able to make something, because we ran some material through these bags a couple of times and it just came out terrible. It just looked
Hmm.
poor and wet and nasty, and it wasn't inspirational. But a friend of mine at the time, breeder Steve, had some shishka berry that he had just grown from the yellow line. So there was two lines of shishka berry. There was the red line and the yellow line, and that was in regards to the Afghan that was being used for the cross. And the yellow was my favorite. And he had some material. He said, "Here, run this through those bags." And I produced something that was really quite nice. Even with just two bags, I saw it bubble and melt, and I was like, okay, I'm on the right track. We're isolating glands. I ended up going to Amsterdam to try and sell those bags, because I certainly didn't think in my own mind I would ever make my own. That's not how I go. But I didn't have a good sort of experience in Amsterdam asking for that and trying to get that. And I left kind of quite dismayed and quite bummed
Hmm.
out that my sort of dream of selling water hash bags in Canada was coming to an end. And I ended up coming home, and my wife just said, "Hey, why don't we make our own?" And I was just like, "We can do that." And that's really how bubble bags were born. But it all really started from that first bowl at the Thai food restaurant in Amsterdam
Wow.
with the "if it don't bubble, it ain't worth the trouble." And in fact, years later in 1999, when I started the company and I created, Bubble Hash and Bubble Bags and Bubbleman, if you look back, my motto was, "If it don't bubble, it ain't worth the trouble." And it still is. And so Skunkman Sam emailed me about that, like maybe a month after I started the company. And he was like, I saw the name, it was like Skunkman Sam in his email. And he was like, "Hey, where did you hear, if it don't bubble, it ain't worth the trouble? And do you know who first said that?" And I wrote him back and I said, "Listen, I absolutely know. The first time I heard it was through Rob. I honored that you would email me. Listen, if you want me to stop using it, no problem. If you want me to give you credit, no problem. Whatever you like, you let me know. And that's really how I kicked it off with Sam. He right away wrote me back. It's exactly what he wanted to hear. He didn't want to, like me to be like, oh, screw you, it's mine, I can do what I
Right.
want type of thing. But that's the cannabis community for you. You reach out to people, and
Yeah.
often you'll get that sometimes. And I wrote him back the way he wanted, and we just became friends and sort of hit it off from there. And he really became a mentor to me, down the road. And obviously, he's been a huge inspiration in my life for the last 20 plus years. And it's just been great being good friends with both of them.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a cool story. And how did your um, macro photography come about? Was that intertwined in some way with your you know, diving really deep into understanding what was influencing good hash and the size of these trichomes, what the trichomes look like, and all that, or was it kind of a separate thing altogether?
No, no, it was definitely influenced by all of that. First trichome shots I ever saw were in 1995 in Amsterdam by Joop Dumas, a Dutch photographer who had, I don't know how he gained access to this, but he had access to the electron scan microscope from
Oh,
the
cool.
university. He was taking pictures of like single trichomes and printing them like full size. He had postcards all over the smart shops and head shops of the city. I ended up meeting him that year. He had a booth as well. And yeah, I was just really inspired by his photography. I knew it wasn't going to be realistic for me to get an electron scan microscope. So I just kept I kept my eyes on it for the next few years, 95. In fact, I wouldn't take my first macro shot till 2008, to give you an idea how early on
Oh,
this guy
wow.
was
Yeah.
ahead of his time. So, maybe around 2006 or 7, Jason King started taking the odd macro shot.
Hmm.
For the Canna Bible, I kind of approached him and was like, hey, like, can you show me how to do some macro photography? And he said, oh, yeah, sure. As soon as you show me how to manufacture and sell bubble bags all over the world, I'll show you how to macro photograph. And I was like, oh, wow, we're going to play that card. Okay.
Oh,
Which is
never
great,
mind.
because I told him then, I said, look, man, you have a choice right now to be the guy that turned me on to macro photography, or you get to be the guy where I get to tell this story every time. And I've told this story probably a dozen times, and it's the truth. It just is the truth. He was super insecure. He was worried that I was going to come and take what he saw
Sure.
as
Yeah.
his. And I mean, let's be honest, my macro photography blew him out of the water. He never moved forward. Now, there's been macro photographers that have blown me out of the water, thank God. And I could name
Sure.
quite a
Yeah.
few, and Eric Nugshots and Shale and
Hmm.
Dynasty Genetics. There's some incredible macro photographers. I would be remiss without really truly mentioning the people that supported me in macro photography around that 2007, 2008. They were members from Overgrow. One of them was named Monkey. He would take photographs of praying mantises that he would grow from eggs that he ordered over the internet,
Oh, wow.
as well
Yeah.
as some cannabis shots. Perhaps Your Giddy Aunt was another character from London, England, he took the first clear dome shot, a perfect bubble on top of a stainless steel screen, back around 2007 as well. And they were inspirational to me. I contacted them both. They were like, oh, you want to get the MPE, you want to get the 24 MTEX dual flash from Canon, you want to get this body, you want to set your ISO at 100, you want to set, so just giving me everything. And because they were so incredible, they get to be the part of the story where they got to inspire and really help create the Bubbleman aspect of macro photography. Like, I couldn't have done it without them. They were so kind and so generous, and I just always feel like giving them a shout out when I talk about my macro photography. It's why I've always been generous in the same way. When people ask me what tripod or head or
Hmm.
whatever it is I'm using, I don't keep anything a secret. It's just such a fear and scarcity mentality. I'd rather go for the love and abundance. Does it
Yeah.
hurt sometimes when I look at some of these macro photographers who have just blown my work right out of the water? Sure, a little bit, but it feels a lot better on the flip side of things to just see how far they're taking it. Shale with his template showing the size of the trichomes, Eric Nuggs with the videos that go into the plants and spinning. It's all just so spectacular, and my hats off to all of those guys for pushing it much further than I managed to. We all just got to accept our places in the ladder.
That's the
You know,
thing.
you
Yeah.
might you might get to be two or three rungs in the ladder, but you're never going to be the whole ladder. So just we all stand on the shoulders of giants. and we should acknowledge those giants as often as we can.
Yeah, that's a really great perspective, and something I think that a lot of people listening that are maybe getting involved in the cannabis industry right now should really take stock of, because it's easy, depending on what, here in the United States, from my perspective, think about, depending on what state you're in and what the regulatory structures are and everything, and how you're trying to get into the business, or even looking at the hemp space and all of these competing CBD companies and everything. It's very easy to fall into that mentality that, I've got my lane, my space, I own this, this is my, baby that I'm nursing. And, you kind of uh, try to keep everybody else away to protect your territory. But you're right. We all are playing a part in a bigger narrative, a bigger story that goes way beyond us. And if we can appreciate our place in that, and appreciate that there's a lot of fulfillment to be derived in helping others go further than we have. I mean, that's something that I really like as an educator. I get the opportunity to teach people that are learning to study the science of cannabis and that are going to be the next generation cannabis scientists. And, they're going to do things that I could never have imagined being able to do, especially at their age, and the tools and resources they're going to have available. They're going to go so much further than I'll be able to in my career. But that's awesome to be a part of, that you're helping to breathe life into this fractal system that is taking off far beyond where you can see where it's going to go. um
That's it. That's it. When you tap into love and abundance, you realize that Jah did indeed make enough for everyone.
yeah,
When you're tapped into fear and scarcity, it's like, man, there's only one piece of pie left, and I'm gonna have to take that piece.
right, exactly, yeah. And the photography world now, it's so mind-blowing to see how far it's come now that Instagram is here, and now that people don't have to be afraid to share their work. When I was growing up and when you were growing up, and prohibition was such a serious thing. I mean, you're talking about, you kind of came from a more conservative area. My home state is actually Mississippi, one of the most conservative, prohibitionist heavy places in the United States, unless you have cannabis in your house. A lot of people don't know that it was decriminalized in the 70s. You can have an ounce in your house, but they bust you on the road. That's where they get you. But now we're in this world where people are comfortable sharing their closet grows and their hobby photography, trying to grapple with these things, and they can have conversations with all sorts of big players in the field on social media and share. And it's just been wild to see that evolution. And one thing I wanted to ask you is, um, given that you're in Canada, what is your general feeling about how legalization is unfolding in Canada, especially given, particularly in British Columbia's history of dispensaries that have been operating for so long. I mean, as long as I can remember, there have been shops in one form or another that have been trying to serve that need of getting cannabis to patients and stuff. Um, but how has that kind of all evolved and changed with legalization that's come through?
Well, it depends on the side that you sit, like
Yeah,
obviously, look, if it's a free for all and you can do whatever you want without ever having anyone over check your work, look over your shoulder, that's the easiest thing ever. So obviously people loved being able to grow their herb. Oh, there's a little mold on there, don't worry about it. Oh, we got bugs, it's fine. Like just trim it up, we'll sell it to the clubs. All of that like lack of regulation. I'm part of the regulations in cannabis bother me, but part of the regulations in cannabis I'm quite happy with. And I
yeah,
hope that some of the cannabis regulations spill over into our water, food, and air
yes,
industries
I
because those
agree.
things are
Yeah,
currently toxic poisons. And so, there's things in the industry where you shake your head and it's like, listen, it's like, it's been a free for all these years. And now we're just trying to enter into this system that literally everything else is in.
yeah,
Everything else. So you get these people who have never been a part of these systems, and they're like, "Well, this is just ridiculous. Like, why do we have to have HR, and why do we have to have health and safety, and why do we have to test everything so much? And this is just absurd and ridiculous. It's all built to crush the business." And you can feel that way on one part, but it's like actually all of that is in place to protect people. It's not to to try and stifle business. It's actually to protect people, to be able to monitor things, to be able to do recalls. Like, have you ever heard of a
Yeah.
recall in the cannabis industry before it was legal? Like,
Right.
oh, I guess all of that stuff that was grown with Avid and Eagle 20 and all of these
Yeah.
poisons just got smoked. Like, nobody threw that shit away. It was smoked by people, and that is kind of shitty. Like, we
Yeah.
should have regulations in place that say, like, it's funny because a licensed production facility will get a recall, and then all the old activists that are very much, listen, we're humans, we can't help but be divided, and the easiest way to conquer us is, of course, to divide us. So that's always going to be an important play as well. But the activists that feel that this has been a false legalization and that it's really not real,
Hmm.
they'll see a recall happen and they'll say, "See, these guys don't even know how to grow. They're growing shit." It's like, well, most people grow shit. They
Hmm.
just do it in a regulated system where if you grow shit, you get called out on it. Whereas when you're in a black market situation
Yeah.
and you know that you grew that crop to pay for your mortgage, rent, whatever, you think it's going in the garbage? Like, I'll tell you, I knew conscious Rasta growers in Jamaica that would still go and be like, "Oh, well, like the crop's going to die. Like, let's just get some of that fungicide." Well, that fungicide's illegal in most countries. They sent it to Jamaica because there's no rules or regulations there. Every time I went to a field in Jamaica, I would walk around the outer area of the field and I would look for these bottles of fungicide
Mm.
that they would use, and I would catch them left, right, and center, and just be like, "Listen, I'm not making hash out of your field. I'm not smoking any of your product. This is poison." So there's a real, like, can you imagine how many people would pay income tax if we weren't forced to do it? That's
Right.
exactly how many
Right.
people would throw away their herb if they weren't forced to do it. And that
Yeah.
says a lot about this industry that's all about the patients.
Yes. Yes. Yep. That's what runs through my mind quite a lot. Is that some of the same people that were chanting, it's for the patients, it's for the patients. Um, some of them were some of the first ones to totally change their attitude. They almost never talk about patients anymore. And it's basically like, what's the hustle now? Now that they've buttoned up this regulation, what can we hustle and get around um, to capitalize on, before the next loophole is closed? And it's been very disheartening in some senses to see, but you also expect it, right? I mean, because when you deal with a market and lots of people, you know that there are going to be those people that will get away with whatever they can get away with for as long as they can get away with it, because that's just how they operate. And then you have other people that you know view things differently and really care about the quality of what reaches the consumer. And it's not just about making money, but it's really putting that intention in. And I think one thing that's interesting is legalization in some ways kind of raises the veil, in some sense, on some of those actors, to kind of see, like,
Yeah.
well, who's actually really trying to produce high quality clean product that's going to actually be medicine for people, if that's the type of product they're making, versus just trying to make money.
Yeah, no, for sure. People have to understand this plant is extremely powerful. Okay, in the 14th century, the Sufis were gathered in the square in Cairo, and they would put their fingers down their throats, the soldiers, and if they threw up
Hmm.
green, they were considered hashish eaters, and they had their teeth wrenched out with pliers. They did
Yeah.
not stop consuming cannabis. Throughout the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, the DEA shot and murdered people, killed dogs, stole children from their families, locked up parents for decades on end, and people did not stop growing cannabis. So if they think what we have to deal with now is harder than all the things that we've come through, and this has
Right.
been going on a lot longer than the 20, 30, 40, or 50 years that any of us have been involved in this. And it's funny to very rarely do you hear people mention that the history of cannabis is very, very long. It's hundreds of years, if not thousands of years.
Right.
and it's a lot. The prohibition of that plant has been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years, and the
Hmm.
fact that we've now gotten to a point where all we really have to do is deal with regulators and different people. I would say we've got this. I would say that we are strengthened and hardened by the adversities that the cannabis prohibitionists put us through over the years, doing all of these different things, taking our kids, shooting our
Hmm.
dog, taking our home, destroying our lives, and still not putting a dent in our dedication to cannabis and to making cannabis available to people. 25 years ago, we certainly had no idea that cannabis could shrink tumors through apoptosis. We had no idea that it could stop seizures in its tracks. A lot of these things, most people were like, well, if you're doing chemo, it'll help you not vomit. And that's like, will
Hmm.
increase the quality of your life. It's like, actually, it will increase the timeline of your life if you allow it to. And when you bring that kind of concept into play, you think that there could potentially be crimes against humanity wavered against some of these prohibitionists who made this a reality for so many people. How many people's loved ones passed away earlier than
Yeah.
they needed to? How many people lived a quality of life that was so much lower than the quality of life that would be available? I mean, just look at Alzheimer's. Those people are sitting in
Hmm.
rooms drooling. They have no knowledge of even where they are. They start giving them cannabinoids. The next thing you know, they're telling stories about the 40s and the 50s. They're dancing to their favorite record. These are realities that are happening today. And
Yeah.
so I feel very blessed to be a part of cannabis in this timeline. I can tell you 25 years ago, when I had friends getting popped left, right, and center and being given dimes, 10-year sentences, like the judge was giving away CDs like Oprah Winfrey, and you get 10 years, and you get
Yeah.
10 years, and you get 10 years. It was sickening. It was beyond sickening. It was very difficult for me to sell bubble bags, knowing that potentially one of my customers could be caught manufacturing and be given a 10 to 20-year sentence. Now, bubble bags were so new for the longest time that the police never really figured them out. I'll never forget one guy saying that he got caught with a grow, and they arrested him and they took him in, and he spent the weekend and he was in the middle of doing a bubble batch. Well, when he came home, his entire place was smashed out and everything was taken except his bucket was
Wow.
sitting in the corner with his water. And he said, yeah, it wasn't an ideal situation as it had sat there for a couple of days, but yeah, I basically pulled those bags and got like close to an ounce of bubble. And he was like, that got me through like my next year and a half, like through my court and through all this different stuff that he had to deal with. And I thought, now that's the kind of story that I like to hear.
Yeah. Wow. That is fascinating. That's crazy. Oh, and something I want to make sure to ask you, because I always have to check myself and remember that some people listening aren't as familiar with some of the terminology and things that we're using. Can you describe to, let's say, an audience that is totally unfamiliar with bubble hash at all? Can you just describe in really simple terms what bubble hash is and what that process looks like?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So anyone that's ever seen a cannabis plant, you've seen that it's got this frost on it. Sometimes some people like to call it the crystals. Some people call it the THC, even though that's not really accurate. What it actually is called glandular trichomes. And if you go to bubblemanbrand.com and you look up under photography, I have some beautiful macro photographs from seed right till the end of like finished product and all the different microns and dry sifts and all these different things. So these little crystals are little mushroom like creatures. They have a stalk and they have a little head on the end of them. Inside that head is where the magic happens with cannabinoids and terpenes. And so bubble hash is really just those heads broken off. And I'll give you a little explanation. So inside that head, we have things called organelles, two of them on either side. You have a plastid and a vacuole. Plastids produce phenols, which are alcohols, and the vacuoles produce hydrocarbons, which are terpenes. So these hydrocarbons and phenols push up into the upper membrane of this little globe, and they basically start synthesizing CBGA with the help of UVB and probably some other things that we're
Yeah.
not even aware of at this point in time. So all of the compounds, all of the cannabinoids, which is THCA, CBDA, CBGA, there's a lot of them. You can look them up, as well as the entire terpene profile. And there's upwards of 180 of those, from humulene to terpenoline to alpha pinene to myrcene and beta caryophyllene, which is the one that drug dogs were always tested in because
Yeah.
it's often a dominant terpene, very peppery, and very, very noticeable to a dog's nose. So those little heads are where the magic occurs, where the medicine is produced. So that wax membrane holds it all in place. Bubble hash is basically, and you can do this at home. You could take a little bud, you could put it in a glass of water with an ice cube or two. You can kind of shake it up, break that bud up, shake it all up. And what'll happen is the little resin glands will become very brittle in the cold. That wax makes them very brittle. It'll break off right at the neck where the head sits at, which is the most easily broken area. It'll break off, and due to the density of the trichome head and the fact that it's oil filled, it's still affected by gravity and water. And that's really the magic of bubble hash. So those little glandular trichome heads sink in the water while everything else stays afloat. And then we just pull micron screen bags accordingly. First one pulls out all the flour, the second one pulls out, some contaminant, and then you start getting these different gland heads at different micron diameters. So that's really what bubble hash is. It's the medicinal components that are produced by the plant in these glandular trichomes. And cannabis is by no means the only plant that produces glandular trichomes. There are hundreds of plants that secrete essential oils out of glandular trichomes. So mint is one, yerba mate, lavender has trichomes, chamomile. There's a whole variety of
Even
plants that
tomatoes.
produce these. Tomatoes have trichomes on them as well. Not all trichomes are producing essential oils.
Right.
Some are more like protective mechanisms. They might be really sticky, or they might be acrid, or they might be, a variety of things. But there are a lot of plants that you can find if you get your little macro camera out there, that you can start seeing these little trichomes growing all over the plants. So that's what bubble hash is: the head of the trichome, isolated to a 99.9% ratio. That's why I called it bubble hash, because hash from a third world like Morocco or
Yeah.
Afghanistan is really, like, I would doubt that it's even 10 or 20% glandular trichome heads.
Yeah. Yeah. It's well, and that's one thing I was getting to is sort of the question of why would you do bubble hash over, dry sift, just making keef and pushing it together and everything. And um, generally, my response is, as particularly when you're doing a micron gradient, is that purity element that you can really dial in your purity in a good way, and getting things cold, like you pointed out, getting the trichomes brittle and everything. It aids in that process. So that
It
it's
makes it
all.
easy for Joe Blow to do
Yeah.
it, because producing full melt 99.9% dry sift. Now, don't get me wrong, there's been some tricks and tips that were given out, and you'll notice that all these people that are making this really nice dry sift were not making it before those tips and tricks. They like to hold their tech close to their chest, but the
Yeah.
bottom line is the history is there. They were not producing this until key people gave away key tips and tricks, static tech being a huge one. Without static tech, there'd be very few of these people producing full melt 99.9% dry sift. Some of them have gotten a little full of themselves. They think they're a little bit more than they really are. And that's
Yeah.
okay. Sometimes that happens. But the bottom line is you got to stay humble and just, pass on these little tricks and tips. Mies, I would shout out Mies. Mies is the first one to really take my carding technique, which was really just carding glandular trichomes back and forth. And he took a DVD case, wrapped it in a parchment paper, and did the same
Mm.
process. And magically, on one side, glands would stick, and on the other side, glands would contaminant would be there. Now, it's not the be all end all. It's a very slow process. I think the Jungle
Yeah.
Boys and some other guys are using paint rollers that they wrap in parchment to kind of create that as well. It's definitely not a way to produce kilos and kilos and kilos, but it is a great way to get people who never had access to the
Mhm.
game before into the game as a player.
And what does that look like if someone wanted to scale up bubble hash making? Because it's something that most of what I've seen around, at least here in Oregon, California, and everything, is most people doing solvent extraction, and a lot of the solvent lists. Um, there's been a lot of attention on rosin lately, but I haven't heard much about scaled up bubble hash making. So, how does that translate? when you try to scale it up?
Oh, it translates fairly well. Our team over at Whistler Technologies has done an exceptional job at scaling. Shout out to the two Daves and Kelvin Wong, the engineers for Whistler, as well as Daniel Lantello, the founder, and my business partner. They've done a really good job in producing. Now, listen, innovation wise. They focused on the impeller, making sure that the
Hmm.
impeller's angles and the distance and the speed and the ratios were all there. Baffles inside the unit. I use a Whistler 300 unit. It's absolutely a workhorse. It's a really good unit. I can put 5 to 8 kilos into this thing dry. Higher amounts, obviously, of fresh frozen. I like to go a little lower, like 5 to 6 kilos. I'm quite comfortable. Once I get into the 7 to 8 range, I get a little bit more nervous that I'm going
Yeah.
to affect my purity and then I'm going to affect my yield. So I pay very close attention to my yields. I want to get as close to the COA for cannabinoid content as possible. So if it says it's a 23% cannabinoids, I want 20 to 21 to 22% returns. Now there's still wax and there's still terpenes, but as long as I can get that return of cannabinoids from the COA, I feel like I'm being quite efficient in the 90+% range of what I'm
Yeah.
getting off. And we also produce 1,000 liter reactors as well as 2,000 liter reactors, which you can imagine if you're putting 5 to 8 kilos dry into a 300, you can
Mhm.
imagine how much goes into 1,000 and into a 2,000 liter reactor. So we've got a few of these machines deployed around North America right now, and we've got a really nice 2,000 liter times two unit that's being designed and prepped by our engineers right now. So it's the game is on. Like we are
Yeah.
definitely scaling up water extraction. I've now seen in the last year maybe 3 or 4 more companies that were not, we were alone in the space for years, and now there's like Delta Separations has a
Hmm.
machine,
Yeah.
Iced Extracts has a machine. um, God, I'm thinking there's at least 3 or 4 of them that I've seen. A couple of different people that are just creating and designing their own machines, and it's great. It's going to be helpful. This is not a game for the small person. The problem with doing large scale extraction of cannabis is you need a lot of cannabis, and the only
Yeah.
way to do the R&D on that is to have access to a lot of cannabis and be willing to potentially make mistakes and lose resin while you're doing your process. So that's why you don't see everyone doing it. It's You got to have the cultivars, you got to have the access, and you also have to, here in Canada, have the permits and licensing to be able to
Yeah.
do it as well. So all of these things line up. And they have lined up for Whistler Technologies quite wonderfully. It's a team that I'm very excited to work with, and yeah, check us out at whistlertechnologies.ca if you want to check out a larger scale stainless steel, super high end quality production. It's really a joy to work with the equipment.
Very cool. And what what is it that would attract an extractor to go the bubble hash route over other extraction routes?
Well, I mean, it's really one of the quickest and easiest ways to isolate trichome gland heads into a 99.9% purity without
Yeah.
using a solvent, without melting it down.
Mhm.
It's the only way to isolate and separate the glands by micron diameter, which we've seen over the years also isolates and separates the medicinal components of the plant. I've seen, appetite from 45, sleep from 90,
Interesting.
pain
Yeah.
relief from 120. It's not always the same from one
Of
cultivar. So now
course.
you can take
Yeah.
a cultivar, you can isolate them by their micron diameters. You can start taking those micron diameters and formulating and mixing them from different cultivars. So that's kind
Yeah.
of the future that I see in cannabis, where we can start. There's a lot of mechanisms that are going on in the brain that are complex when we
Hmm.
consume these compounds, and it's great to consume a single plant and a single plant resin and what people call full spectrum. I would go a little further and say real full spectrum is like 8 or 9 or 10 different cultivars that you've extracted together, and now you have, because let's be honest, if you want a cultivar with a certain cannabinoid like THCV, well, you're going to need a specific cultivar for that. You're not going to find it in a bunch of the CBD cultivars that are in the US right now. Those are generally
Yeah.
South African genetics that produce a cannabinoid like that. And I'm sure it's the same for CBG and CBC and CBT and all of these different cannabinoids. So having access to a multitude of cultivars to be able to mix and match and formulate is something I'm pretty excited about.
I'm glad you brought up the full spectrum thing because that was something I really wanted to ask your opinion on before we close up here, because it seems it seems like full spectrum, broad spectrum, whole plant. These are all terms that it seems like every company defines differently, which makes it extremely confusing for consumers. Um, and the marketing message that floats around is that, oh, you want full spectrum, and then all these companies define what full spectrum is, and then try to drive consumers towards that. So, I mean, you already alluded to how you conceptualize sort of a purist perspective of what full spectrum is. But can you elaborate a little more on your perspective on these different terms and how you've seen them played out? Because they've really, I mean, from I've been around in the industry for only about like 15 years or so, and I've really noticed these terms get really popular over the last 5 years, 7 years or so, where they're like really, everyone's really talking about it and blended it into their branding. So, what's your perspective on that?
Well, it's pure marketing, and it's come from our conversations on Hash Church. There's absolutely no doubt. You called the timeline to the perfection. Keep in mind it was Skunkman Sam who was the one who discovered the modality, the modulation effects of terpenes. He did it in 2000. He hit up Ed Rosenthal, who wrote the article on myrcene. He hit
Hmm.
up Ethan Russo, who created the
Yeah,
ensemble effect. He hit me up. It was the first time I had ever smoked pure THCA, and then pure THCA with a single terpene. It was a world of difference. So he opened our eyes up to this modulation. The rest of the world didn't get to become a part of that conversation until I invited him into Hash Church in 2014. That's when we started talking about terpenes. That's when Horatio started making terpenes, and Tony started making terpenes, and Kay from Trichome Technology was doing terpenes, and Sam was opening up this whole conversation. And of course, what people do is they listen and then they become experts the next day, and they're like, well, terpenes are very important. It has to be full spectrum. It's like, well, that's just not true. And my perfect example is like, listen, the plant is producing a variety of things for us, and whatever works is what we should be able to do for ourselves. We should not try to pigeonhole anyone into it's all about full spectrum. I listen to Hash Church, and terpenes modulate the effects. You can't not have all the terpenes there. And it's like, I've talked to people about the validity of having monomolecular isolates
yeah,
versus full spectrums. One of the most valuable aspects that I always bring to the table in the sense of the conversation is that, let's say, okay, full spectrum, you're all about your full spectrum. You're giving full spectrum to a child with Dravet syndrome. It works for the first 6 months, no problem. But something happens in the grow room at one point in time. There's variables that occur. Pressures are lost. Heat and temperatures are lost. Things change. Maybe something happened in the water. The expression changes, and now that medicine no longer works for that patient.
yeah,
So the value that I see monomolecular isolates and terpene extractions and formulations are, I never want full spectrum to go away. But I
yeah.
also will always fight for monomolecular isolates, because what if there are companies that can come in the future, test a full spectrum cultivar that's being used for neurologically sensitive folks like Dravet syndrome and whatnot, and what say we take that cultivar, we deconstruct it, we reconstruct it in a formulated
Hmm.
room where everything is exactly what it was every single time.
It's
You've got the
consistent.
recipe. It's absolutely beyond consistent, more consistent than the plant itself will ever
Yeah,
be able to be. And now you've got the best of both worlds. We didn't have to get rid of one. Humans just want to put up a fence all the time. Oh, monomolecular, no, full spectrum, no, monomolecular, no, broad
yeah,
spectrum. It's like, oh
yeah.
my God, you guys are fighting for the same plant. Like, you can both have that.
Right. These are
It
all
doesn't have to
tools.
be. It doesn't have to be one or the other, which is the part that I just sometimes want to bang my head, because we just want to pick what we want. And
Hmm.
that took me a long time, being a water hash and a solvent guy. Now I'm at the point where I, of course, would fight for anyone's right to extract any way that they want. I would fight for the BHO guys and fight for the CO2 guys and fight for the ethanol guys, because We all have our choices and our personal preferences, and I want them all to be available, because what
Yeah.
better way to choose when they're all actually available for you to choose, where you can actually make a choice and say, hey, this medicine works for me, or whether it's recreational, it reduces my anxiety and my stress, and it works for me for what I want. So I like the idea of all of these things being made available, and I try not to get myself stuck in a position where I'm choosing what is best. What's best for me is certainly not what is best for you.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's an excellent way to sum that up. The way I view it is all of this are, it's all tools in the tool chest, with appropriate applications and, things that are going to be ideal for one person or another. And I'm very much of the same mind, but I think there's definitely room for isolates and standardized formulations. You need standardization. You need consistent products, particularly for people that are in a dire need for cannabinoids and they can't afford for the next batch to be substantially different. So yeah, absolutely. I think there's room for everything. And I know we're getting at almost an hour 15 here. I want to be respectful of your time. I've got one last question to kind of wrap things up, which is, um, what are you kind of focused on now? What are you excited about now, and looking into the future? And what projects do you see on the horizon?
I'm most excited about my Whistler Technologies and my Embark Health. I'm hoping on getting my brand into the Canadian market, which is Bubbleman brand. I'd love
Nice.
to be able to sell hash in Canada for the first time in over 20 years after teaching everyone how to make it and produce it on their
That'd
own.
be
I think
wild.
that would be very, very sweet. I'm quite looking forward to that. And working with Segra, the tissue culture company, I'm hoping
Mm.
to take on more responsibilities with them and help facilitate. I think it's absolutely the future of cannabis, because I know it's the present of all clonally produced plants on the planet right now. So between those three things, that's a lot on my plate. I'm quite excited about all that. And for anyone sitting on the West Coast right now listening to this, I'm sure you're probably aware, but in about a minute and 45 seconds, the clock will hit 4:20. And I hope that you have something rolled or packed or ready to vaporize, because what better thing to enjoy in life than a nice bowl of full melt hash or a beautiful spliff while listening to Jason's podcast?
Oh, that is an excellent way to cap all of this off. That's so observant of you. I didn't realize we're coming up close on the time. Let's go ahead and get this wrapped up in the next minute. Well, Marcus, it's been a delight to finally cross paths with you. Like I said, it's so fascinating for me on the podcast side to have been indirectly connected to so many people in the industry through reading your writing, seeing your photos, reading forums and learning about hash making, all these different things, and then to finally cross paths with you. It's super cool for me, and honestly kind of surreal in a way that I've been able to have the opportunity to talk to so many, awesome, knowledgeable people. So thanks so much for being willing to sacrifice your time and energy to come on the podcast today. And I look forward to following your work, and maybe we'll catch up again some other day.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Jason. I appreciate your time as well. It was indeed an honor to share some time with you on your podcast and with your audience. And I'll finish it how I finish all my shows. May the full
Perfect.
melt bless your bowl sooner than later.
That's
Peace out,
perfect.
everybody.
Awesome. All right, everybody, stay curious and take it easy. If you want to learn more about cannabis, check out the Curious About Cannabis book on Amazon.com and other major online book retailers. To support the show and get access to an exclusive members-only podcast feed, access to private events, merchandise discounts, and more, visit www.patreon.com/curiousaboutcannabis.